Well, hi everyone. Thank you for joining. I am Thea Roberts from the Partnership to Improve Patient Care, or PIPC. And I do want to note before we get started that we generally provide live captioning on our webinars. And unfortunately, there seems to be like a nationwide surge of need for captioning, and we did not get any specific accommodation requests. So there's not a live captioner here, but we will be captioning the webinar to host it on our website after the fact if people would like that. So getting into the meat of the webinar, recently Health Advances completed a paper with contributions from PIPC and the Everylife Foundation for Rare Diseases on assessing the value of cell and gene therapies. We thought the findings of the paper were so interesting that it warranted pulling together a group of experts on the topic to share and discuss them. So thank you all for joining that discussion. I'm going to set the stage and then turn it over to our presenters, who are Jennifer Bright with the Innovation and Value Initiative, Julia Gabler with Health Advances, Annie Kennedy of the Everylife Foundation for Rare Diseases, and Jen McNary, who is a rare disease patient advocate. So cell and gene therapies are revolutionary advancements that offer potentially life-altering benefits and in some cases even cures for patients with rare or incredibly severe diseases. With the advent of these new therapies, many value assessment organizations, including governmentally sanctioned HTAs abroad, as well as non-governmental nonprofits like the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, or ICER, have been trying to determine how to assess their value, generally reverting back to the traditional methods that they use to assess other drugs. As many of you know, patients and people with disabilities have long expressed concern with traditional value assessments that generally are cost effectiveness analyses, particularly due to their use of the quality adjusted life year, or QALY, which undervalues treatments for those with disabilities and chronic illnesses. Many of the issues patients have raised holistically with CEA seem to become even more pronounced when we're dealing with cell and gene therapies. So our goal today will be to discuss this and get to the point of how we can do better. How can we assess these revolutionary treatments in a way that we're really informing value to the patient versus just value to the payer? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Julia Gabler. Thanks, Julia.
Sure. Hi, everybody. I don't know if we should just, I'm Julia Gabler. I'm a partner at Health Advances, and it was a real pleasure to work with Everylife Foundation and PIPC on this evaluation. And I guess we could just, I think that was a great introduction, Thayer, and I guess we could advance to the next slide. So yeah, just to pick up a little bit on what Thayer introduced, you know, as the cell and gene therapies advance through to approval and patient access, and Thayer gave an example of some that are already available, the debate about how best to assess and quantify their value has only increased. And just to give a little bit more depth to what Thayer introduced is the traditional method of value assessment, which has been around for a very long time. But the traditional one is rooted in the notion of cost effectiveness analysis, CEA, which broadly we provide the formula here, but basically it looks at, it produces an ICER, or incremental cost effectiveness ratio statistic. And that ICER is defined as the difference between the costs of a new versus some comparator, usually a standard of care, divided by the difference between the effectiveness. So what's important to know here is that CEA is by definition comparative. So it's always very important to keep in mind what is that standard of care that these rare cell and gene therapy treatments may be compared to. So this is the overall framework for cost effectiveness analysis and the production of that ICER, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio statistic. And generally what health technology assessment agencies around the world do, who really leverage this framework, is they come up with this ICER statistic, which will then provide a threshold. And if the ICER statistic is below their threshold, it's considered a good buy, good value for money. If it falls above that threshold, it's generally not considered a good buy. And so this is in fact how a lot of countries make decisions or inform their decisions about what to cover and provide access to for patients. So we can go to the next slide. So QALY specifically, it's actually a subset of cost effectiveness analysis called cost utility analysis, where that denominator, that measure of effectiveness, is specifically unified into a single metric called the QALY, or the quality adjusted life year. And here, this basically allows apples to apples comparisons across different disease areas, across different patient populations, because what you're doing is you're saying, okay, let's just bring everything about the effectiveness of an intervention into this metric called a QALY. And this is a measure of disease or disability burden, and the treatment efficacy in mitigating it. And we'll go into a little bit more depth, but basically you measure QALYs in terms of these utils or utilities, where 1 is essentially a year in perfect health, 0 is worth death, and then anything in between is where you're disabled or sick. We also recognize that there actually are states recognized as worse than death, which can be in the negative. Okay, we can go to the next slide. And so this just again provides an even deeper look. And the reason we're focusing on this is because as you review this, it may sort of become apparent that these QALYs cannot capture everything that we believe the cell and gene therapies provide for patients. And so this QALY is commonly used in cost effectiveness analysis. And if you look at this figure, what you see, the light blue in the number 1 would be the measure of both health-related quality of life and quantity of life in years. It's that light blue area. And so that is without the intervention, that number 1, that blue bar. And you can imagine this is disease where, for example, over time, you proceed to death and you have a reduced quality of life over time. But now you're going to introduce a new intervention, which is this number 2. And if you look at area A, this is where you're showing this new intervention might not extend life, right? You might not get survival benefits, but it does improve the quality of life that you have that remains. And so it's that area under the curve, that area A, that is what you can measure with the quality adjusted life year. And then you can actually also measure if, for example, this new intervention both adds quality adjusted life years and extends life, then you might have an area under the curve that looks like A plus B. So this is what the QALY is trying to achieve, so that it basically captures more than just survival benefit. So in that way, I think there's a lot of agreement that the QALY it contributed to our sense of value assessment, because you could use now a metric that would get beyond cases averted or something very specific to the intervention or the therapeutic area or the treatment, and take it beyond to a place where you could capture actually the improvement of interventions on the quality of life. Okay, next slide, please. So where do we see cost effectiveness analysis, or more specifically cost utility analysis? And as they're set up, we see this in nationally recognized health technology assessment, or HTA bodies, outside of the US. We see this in the United Kingdom, in England with NICE and the National Health System. We see it in Canada with CADITH. We see it in Australia with PBAC. We also see it in the Nordic countries and in South Korea. Those are all big cost effectiveness analysis countries. And this method of CEA that is very rooted in cost effectiveness analysis and the QALY is one of their primary determinants to figure out at the national level what will be covered and accessible to patients. In the US, however, we also have ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, and I think that their name is, it's not a coincidence that they have the same name as the ICER statistic, that I'm sure was not a coincidence. So they're an independent nonprofit that actually has been producing cost effectiveness analyses since its inception in 2006. And because of this, and it's actually now has completed, I think, more than 60 or 7 assessments, cost effectiveness assessments. And it's now captured the attention of patients, payers, and manufacturers. So again, this is not a government agency. This is an independent nonprofit, but it now has captured attention because of these CEAs that it is producing. But as we'll see on the next page, cost effectiveness analysis and the QALY are problematic. And there have been sort of long debates about cost effectiveness analysis with traditional therapies, but their shortcomings can really be amplified when we apply them to the evaluation of cell and gene therapies. And there are actually many reasons, but we highlight a few here. One, it can be very difficult to choose an appropriate duration of effect for clinical benefits. And this can be because these cell and gene therapies, as you know, are tested in trials that can be relatively short compared to the effect that they might provide. The next issue is patient heterogeneity, and subgroup analyses are not often considered. So these CEAs can sort of default to the average benefit or the average patient. And in very small groups and in rare diseases, you have a lot of heterogeneity, and the QALY just doesn't do a very good job of capturing that. We have talked about, obviously, the QALY itself, and it's a generic measure of health or disease burden, but the QALY cannot capture societal preferences around resource allocation. So if a society just feels that patients with rare diseases just should get extra investment or on par investment, the QALY is not going to capture that. It's also been very widely seen as discriminatory toward patients with disabilities. Next, estimating QALYs gained is difficult for rare diseases that many cell and gene therapies treat, just because we don't know a lot about those diseases yet, and the ability to estimate those QALYs takes time, and we just don't have a lot of that experience yet. And so you have to estimate a utility around a disease state for these models to work, and so there's a lot of work that has to go into that, and we're not always certain that we necessarily have the right one. We talked about the threshold. These thresholds may be too low for rare diseases. If you're going to sort of draw a line in the sand and cover conditions and treatments for diseases that come in under a certain threshold, we have to make sure that threshold is accurate and correct. Finally, the last one is that these additional elements of value afforded by cell and gene therapies, such as increased productivity, reduction of caregiver burden, or even other things like the value of hope or the value of reassurance, these are just not included in QALY analysis. So I think I'll stop there. I've probably gone over, but I'm going to turn it over back to Thayer or to the next speaker. But I think those are sort of, hopefully will couch our discussion.
Great, thank you, Julia. That was really helpful, and I'm sure we will have more in-depth questions for you when we get to a discussion point. So Annie, if you want to continue, Annie and Everylife Foundation contributed to this paper. So Annie, it would be great to have your additions to that.
Sure. And thank you so much, Julia, for setting that up so well. I'm Annie Kennedy, and I'm the Chief of Policy and Advocacy with the Everylife Foundation for Rare Diseases. And I've had some direct experience in the value assessment space and was pleased to be a part of this effort. We can go to the next slide. So I think it's really important first to sort of set the stage to say that from our perspective, value assessments have a really important role to play, and there is really strong potential for value assessments as the science of patient input evolves, that value assessments could really be a powerful tool for patient communities as we work to understand the therapies that are being developed and approved and better understand which therapies are best in which combinations at which time in the trajectory in our various disease stages. But that will best be achieved if really the patients and providers are thought of as an audience for the value assessments. And the way that value assessments are designed today is really with payers as the primary stakeholder and not with patients and providers as stakeholders. So we can go to the next slide. So I think one of the things that is really important to us is we begin to shift this paradigm and we pull some progress that's been made in other ecosystems into the value assessment space. There has been progress made already, but there's always, as always, much more room to continue to grow and improve in this area. So just maybe to start with why, if we remain stagnant and we don't do this, it can be damaging. So I think we'll state the obvious. First and foremost, if products are approved and patients can't receive access to those products once approved, that can have devastating consequences to the patient community. One of the things that can happen if there is a value assessment that's conducted on a product and that value assessment does not take into consideration all of the value elements in the data that's important to patient communities and providers, that value assessment can yield data and information that is misaligned with the priorities of the patient community. And the value assessment can be flawed. And at the end of the day, that could result in payers denying or delaying access to a product. An example is many years ago, there was an approval for PCSK9 inhibitors for a subset of a population with a rare genetic condition called familial hypercholesterolemia. And when that first product was approved, the ICER assessment was unfavorable. And as a result, access was not afforded to the patient community. It was very difficult to navigate. The ramifications of that was that many patients were having cardiac events and ending up in the emergency room, having strokes, because the ICER assessment did not necessarily take into account that the product was designed for a subset of the population that had a genetic predisposition to high cholesterol and not just anyone who would have high cholesterol. So it is really important that value assessments be informed by the proper data and patient experience data, and we'll go a little bit more into that. So let's go into the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit about more opportunities for this. So in another ecosystem, in the regulatory ecosystem, there has been a lot of progress made with respect to how patient experience data is integrated into clinical trial decision-making and regulatory decision-making. And one of the things that we think is incredibly important is that there be an evolution of similar concepts and similar practices now within the value assessment and access space. And we're beginning to see this trend, but this momentum certainly needs to continue. So within patient-focused drug development, which really came out of the Patient-Focused Drug Development Act, and there's been this groundswell of activity and research development. There is data collection that's informing regulatory decision-making, and that data collection is related to the impact of a disease and treatment of those symptoms, patient perspectives about potential and current treatments, views on unmet medical needs and the available medical interventions, and an enhanced understanding of the natural history of the disease or condition. And that data is being collected specific to inform regulatory decision-making and is regulatory and clinical trial grade data. It is regulatory rigor. And similar data is now being collected to inform access decision-making and could similarly be collected to inform the access environment. If we go to the next slide, we can look at within the regulatory environment. Here are examples of some of the types of data that are being included. And in fact, there's even now a framework for how that data is included within the regulatory review. So at FDA, as a product is reviewed, there is actually what's called the patient experience data checklist that a reviewer completes at the time of a review to indicate how that data was used to inform decision-making in the regulatory review. And again, a very similar process could be used and of course modified to include patient experience data that would be most applicable to the value assessment space within the value assessment framework. But again, a really important practice to ensure that preferences that are centered on values that are specific to patients, caregivers, and providers would be included in these frameworks. And the next. So there's been a growing awareness of this. So this webinar, certainly in this paper, is certainly not the first time that this is coming up, and there are a lot of really wonderful groups that are working on some of this. The patient-focused drug development, as we just talked about, PCORI has been doing work around this. We're going to hear in just a moment from Jennifer Bright from the Innovative Value Initiative. There are folks at the Patient-Driven Values and Healthcare Evaluation Center, otherwise known as PAVE. So there are a lot of great work groups doing this work. And ICER has also modified one of their frameworks for ultra-rare diseases. But we need to ensure that this work continues and that some of those newer efforts, IBI, PAVE, PCORI, get pulled more into the center of the lens through which we assess value. Next. So this is especially important now as we are seeing so many potential therapies specific to cell and gene therapies moving through the pipelines. What's unique about cell and gene therapies is that many of them are expected to be single doses or one-time administrations. And the benefits are anticipated to be long-lasting, or what we refer to as durable benefits. And so what's going to be challenging about the existing frameworks being applied to cell and gene therapies is that for existing value assessment frameworks, we really rely on long-term durability information, and we may only have short-term data. And so we're going to have to really work together and really rely on some of that patient experience data, some of those other data sets that I referred to that patient communities have, again, with rigor, collected data around to really help inform the decision making. And I'll again point to, and Jennifer's going to talk at IBI about the work they've done, and here I'm citing some work that PAVE has done. There are patient-centered value elements that are being established by many groups to ensure that we can now start to really consider value through the lens of patients around tolerability, side effects, ability to maintain relationships with family or ability to work, the availability of a treatment. Some of those values that are not traditionally considered within the existing frameworks need to be, again, incorporated more impactfully into these considerations. Next. Okay, so why does this matter? And I think this is probably pretty obvious at this point, but the value assessments are impacting payer determinations and access. These are currently the backbone of the existing assessments. And again, we've been very grateful for much of the momentum that's happened in some of these assessments, but we need to continue to evolve and shift further, especially as we see some of these therapies be approved and the access to patients needs to be made available. So we better understand the impact that they can have on communities. And now we're starting to see some of these also hit other policy proposals. For example, the International Pricing Index, the Executive Order on Most Favored Nations. And so again, this matters because it now shapes and informs policy that could again have negative implications for patient access. And then Julia did a really nice job summarizing quality's implications for patients. Next. Okay, so I think this is actually a really nice segue into how can we do better? Well, we can do better to make sure that when we're assessing the value of healthcare interventions and therapies that are coming to market, that we're really reflecting the value to the patient and the caregiver who will be receiving the treatment, and not just the payer. We need to not think of payers as just the only audience for value assessments, but that value assessments can be another really valuable tool in the toolbox to empower patients as the quarterbacks of their care teams, and that they should be anchored in evidence and values that are deemed meaningful to patients and caregivers. And again, optimally, they can become an additional resource to aid in patient-provider healthcare decision-making. But as they stand today, they are not a tool for patients and providers. They oftentimes are a singular tool for payers, and they often delay or inhibit access to approved therapies. So we can do better, and we need to. So I'm going to now hand it off to Jen McNary, who is a rare disease patient advocate, and someone I've had the privilege of working for a very long time, who I think is going to talk about this a little bit through her personal and community lens. So Jen.
Thank you, Annie, and thank you everybody for setting this up so well. You've all had the privilege of hearing a lot so far about the technical pieces around value assessments. But as always, as a patient advocate and more importantly, a mom, my role today is to bring this back to the actual impact that these issues that we're talking about abstractly will have on these patients living with health issues. About me first, for those of you who don't know me, I'm first and foremost the mother and caregiver to 4 kids. 3 of my sons live with rare diseases, Duchenne and primary immune deficiency. In addition, I support patients with other rare diseases in a variety of ways, professionally and personally through advocacy efforts. And as an advocate, I think we all know that it is our job to make sure that we're nimble enough to change focus as the need arises. And most recently, the thing that has been increasingly apparent that we need to focus on as a result of even my personal experiences with my sons are access and reimbursement challenges. And I always act in this area with the true belief that when a physician and a patient decide on a treatment protocol for a patient, they should have access, period. And so though I don't claim to have the answers that you're hearing throughout this day or throughout this hour, I know that I am firmly rooted in that belief, and that's where I'm acting from. So far today, we've heard in theory what can go wrong with value assessment models when two things are true. Number one, that the motivation in the audience is not patient-centered. And number two, when the model, in most cases the quality, was not in fact built for the purpose of evaluating treatments, especially rare disease treatments. As the mother of an almost 22-year-old son living with Duchenne and his 18-year-old brother, I am old enough to remember the time of diagnosis with Duchenne. 18 years ago, when my sons were diagnosed, I was told that there were no clinical trials, there were no treatments, and that I should just take my sons home, that they would not live to adulthood, and I should love them because nothing could be done. And I think as I talk to other patients, we hear that a lot in rare diseases. Drug companies were not at that time very interested in rare diseases like this, and foundations, family foundations and others were trying to get interest and raise money for research, and that's what the focus was. We have been lucky enough in our family to have lived through a major shift in this narrative, at least for Duchenne. Max, my younger of the two with Duchenne, was one of 12 kids to be enrolled in a study at age 9 for Exondys 51, which with some fierce advocacy efforts was approved in 2016. Unfortunately, at that time, we really didn't have any time to celebrate because we hadn't anticipated personally the issues that would happen after that approval in access and reimbursement. We saw a value in this therapy. It was not a cure, and ultimately, Max stopped walking at the age of 17. However, they still have less fatigue than they did prior to treatment. They have increased abilities. They can use their hands and arms more. They breathe better. Their mobility is better. They have less falls. They have less difficulty moving about in bed. I do not have to get up and roll and move them. These are all things that make my quality of life and their quality of life much better. These are the ways that they can go to college or school on their own. They can do their own shopping. They can participate in sports. In fact, Austin took a train ride to do advocacy in DC last year. And this is something he wouldn't have been able to do at his age with Duchenne. I personally, along with other advocates at the time, set off on a drug utilization review board roadshow after Exondys was approved because I started hearing from families that had been waiting for years to get access. We were in Florida, we were in Maine, California, Oregon, trying to support these families seeking access to this first Duchenne therapy. And it was an uphill battle. And I was trying very hard to understand why the barrier wasn't just science, why we finally had a therapy. It had gone through rigorous review from the agency, but we were still struggling with access. We were then dealt a further blow when this entity called ICER decided to review not just Exondys, but also Emflaza, the approved corticosteroid, and also not yet approved Vyondys. This is important. These entities are not just looking at already approved therapies. They can look at any therapy in the space at any point in time. During this one disaster of a meeting, it was my first ever meeting, I did learn a few things that can be applied to value assessments. For our loved ones living with rare disease, perfect health is not attainable. I think we all know that what we would accept and what healthy people would accept as good health or good outcomes are very different. At birth, generally, our children are already valued as less than human. If they don't walk anymore, their value dips even further according to methods like the QALY. Because the quality of life or utility values are so low for non-ambulant patients based on the current inputs in place, and the costs are relatively higher, a drug that extends survival when the patient is non-ambulant would not be cost effective, even if it were free to us. And although efforts are reportedly being made to include patient voice in the valuations process, everything that's in place today means that we still don't have a vote. The evaluation methods do not place value on those incremental changes that I spoke about earlier. Families living with health conditions will tell you that those incremental benefits make all the difference. You may not be so concerned when your child stops walking, but when they stop being able to feed themselves, when they stop being able to use a keyboard, when they stop being able to roll in bed, those things have grave implications. My sons no longer walk, but I personally place such high value on the abilities they have maintained because of therapy, self-transferring, meal preparations. For Max, he's able to get out of bed and cook himself breakfast. That means I don't have to get up in the morning with this early riser. And Austin has use of his hands. That means he's going to college for mechanical engineering. And both of them breathe without the aid of a machine, which is huge. I've yet to see a working model, and I would love to see one, that adequately incorporates this kind of benefit and assigns it a real value. So we've already heard that entities like ICER are not governmental agencies. So what? So what difference does it make when a self-appointed entity reviews and creates a value report on an innovative therapy? Why does it matter that they're not listening to me? First of all, as was sort of touched upon earlier, but I want to make it very clear, your state Medicaid is making decisions based on these reports. New York and my home state of Massachusetts currently use ICER reports in their decision making. What does this mean for my family? Max and Austin are managed Medicaid recipients, and as of today, they do not receive insurance coverage for any of the only treatments available for their Duchenne, any of them. The drug that was approved based in part on Max's 4 open muscle biopsies over the years when he was 9 to 12 years old, showing improvement, he is not covered for. Secondly, let's think about innovation. This is just one therapy, 2 therapies. We need more therapies. We need a cocktail of therapies. We need gene therapies. Remember when I said that Austin and Max were diagnosed and there wasn't a single clinical trial for them, not a single treatment. Now, 18 years later, we have multiple approved therapies, dozens of clinical trials showing major promise. We know that investors do not invest in rare disease out of the kindness of their hearts, unfortunately. Companies do not choose rare disease because they're interested in donating time and money. It's just not possible. Rare disease drug development had to be incentivized in order to start being popular. And if there is no path to reimbursement, it will stop. I do not want another patient to get a diagnosis of Duchenne and be told that there are no longer companies in this space because it wasn't lucrative. I'm watching the gene therapy space very closely. It's incredibly promising, and there's still hope for my sons for it. But if we can't convince independent assessors that current treatments have any value at all right now, under current reviews, companies would actually have to pay my sons to receive treatment in order for there to be value. How are we ever going to value one-time curative therapies for children or young adults like mine? So I want to give you a few action items because this is always how I end. Next slide, please. I almost forgot there were slides. I'm sorry. You know, the important piece is, I think you skipped one. There you go. So looking into the future, I just want to leave you with the words of the National Council of Disabilities because I think they summed it up very well about QALYs. And then I want to move into just a few action items before I hand it off. QALYs place a lower value on treatments which extend the lives of people with chronic illnesses and disabilities. QALY-based programs have been found to violate the Americans with Disabilities Act. I think those are really powerful words because these types of evaluations are not just wrong, they're not just unfortunate, but I think they're actually illegal and discriminatory. So I never like to present a problem. Anybody who knows me knows that I don't believe in patient patience. So patients do have a really important role to play in speaking up about the shortcomings about current cost effectiveness frameworks. No stakeholder is more important, trust me. You need to think about these issues before they come up. Like when you're starting to fund science, also start to look into these types of issues. You need to start doing research. In my experience, approval day is way too late to learn about health economics. It does start with events like these, and I'm really thrilled that these types of events are happening. You need to educate patients and families and allow them to understand their role. So what is your role? Your role as a patient advocate, or somebody in patient advocacy professionally, is to teach people how to make their voices heard. You can, of course, share your experiences on social media, both with therapies, what types of therapies you want, what types of benefits are meaningful. Write and have a relationship to your member of Congress. Go to Rare Disease Day on the Hill and make sure you have those relationships, because when you need their help, you should have a relationship. Write a letter to the editor, write a blog. This time of virtual interaction, anything you write can go viral, and it will, and it can be shared everywhere. So learn about it, engage with these entities that are assessing value when possible, and come to organizations like Everylife and PIPC to find out where you can engage and at what points and times and how. And then, of course, you can also attend your drug utilization review board meetings locally. It's a good idea to go and talk to them about the kids that live, or the people that live in their communities with these diseases, so that when you do come back to lobby for a therapies approval, they know you and they're much more likely to give that some thought. So I'm also accessible if anybody wants to talk more about this, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen. And we're going to turn over to Jen number 2, Jennifer Bright, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to the prior panelists. Thanks to PIPC for having me on today. I always find it hard to follow a presentation like Jen's. Jen, you just inspire so many thoughts. As a fellow patient advocate, I actually, in my career, grew up in the mental health arena doing patient advocacy. So your messages and your call to action are very near and dear to my heart. I'm here today to talk about all is not lost. And I think to some prior comments, to talk about where there is some laboratory work being done to try to improve things and hopefully provide some solutions. So I am here representing the Innovation and Value Initiative, and you can go to the next slide. And for those of you who don't know IVI, just a brief précis of who we are. We're a nonprofit independent organization, a collective of researchers and policy advocacy folks who are working to do two things: to advance both the science, and that would be the methods and the technology behind value assessment, but also the practice. So how do we get to talking about value assessment? How do we solve some of these problems that have been so eloquently presented by all three of the prior panelists? And our driving principles as an organization are really all the things that you've heard today. It's about collaborating with patients. How do we bring patients into the conversation about what's important to the value equation right at the beginning? How do we embed them in the research that feeds the development of those models? How do we do everything that we're doing in a transparent way so that even if we agree that we haven't hit the right answer yet, at least everybody can see and understand what assumptions, what data, what mechanics are feeding the analysis. And we think that's an important aspect of this, to build, not only to build trust, but to kind of call out some of these deficiencies and put them in the light of day so that we can deal with them instead of just shoving it under the rug. And lastly, think of IVI as a laboratory. We're really focused on how do we build and test new methods, and we're not going to always get it right. I can't tell you today that I've got the silver bullet that's going to solve all these problems, but I can tell you that we wake up every day trying to think about how do we work on this, and with whom. Go ahead to the next slide. So I wanted to tell you just three things, just kind of concrete ways that we're trying to lean in and improve the ecology of value assessment. So there's three areas. You've heard a couple of references to patient-defined priorities or preferences. That's what's important to the patient or the family, patient and family, in terms of achieving the goals that they have for their health. It could be, it might be the actual mechanism of action of a particular drug, but it might be what Jen referred to, the ability to have independence, the ability to take a class, the ability to shower on one's own. Those are viable and real and legitimate goals. but they're probably not the goals that were studied as part of clinical trials to determine whether a drug gets access to market. And consequently, because of that, they are also not the factors that are used in calculating economic value. And that's what we have to shift that paradigm. So we focus in the area of patient preferences. We also focus on a concept called novel elements value, which I'll talk a little bit more. But the idea here is, how can we use economic modeling and economic math, complex math, to help support flexible, what we call flexible localized decision-making, recognizing that payers and clinicians and with their patients may have different needs in examining across treatment options that any given time, and the mix of what goes into that calculus might change depending on where you sit. We need tools that allow that flexibility. That's not a stagnant one slice of the apple view of value. That's complicated, let me just say that. But we need to try. We need to lean in and try to figure out, can we develop models that are tools to help facilitate that kind of flexibility? And lastly, we're working in this space to add to the toolbox of, you've heard a great summary of cost effectiveness analysis and using the quality, but that's not the only method out there. There is also multi-criteria decision analysis, which is complex, but is also widely used in other industries as a way of being representative of multiple stakeholder viewpoints about the concept of value. We need to figure out how to apply that to health. Why? Because it matters. Why? Because patients and families have perspectives that are not adequately represented in status quo thinking, as you've heard. Go ahead to the next slide. So think about IVI as being an organization that's trying to add to the toolbox that we have to talk about value, as opposed to fighting over who has the right tool, which I think is a characteristic of kind of the past few years in the value assessment. But as Annie rightly said, we see positive trends moving in the direction that really embraces some of the viewpoints and insights that have been brought up today. So that's a positive trend. There's hope. So just 3 quick examples of what I said: patient preferences, this novel element of value concept, and MCDA. So just as an example, and I know this is kind of tangentially relevant, but we worked with rheumatoid arthritis patients a few years ago. And what's important for you to understand about this, and you can read up all the detail, the nitty gritty, but what's important about this relationship was the notion that we sat with patients first, and we really tried to understand what were attributes of their health goals and their treatments that they found to be significant to their quality of life and to their determination of whether a medication, a therapy was working for them. And so functional status came up, frequency and site and mode of administration was deemed as important, just a couple of examples. But what you quickly discerned was that those 2 aspects were not well represented in clinical trial data, and so consequently were not incorporated into the assessment of value across different therapeutic options. So one of the things that we did was sit with patients, and through that process built a model that helped incorporate those attributes into the mechanics of evaluating different treatment sequences. So this is just an example of how IVI tries to translate not just the input, but then take the added step of trying to make it fit inside value assessment, as opposed to being an add-on paragraph or a narrative. Oh, by the way, this is important to patients. We need to build the tools that can receive the information that really can give us a more holistic picture of value. Go ahead to the next slide. So this is a very fancy picture, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, except to say that ISPOR in 2018 acknowledged, so this is the field of experts in outcomes research and health economics, basically came out with the lions of the community saying, look, we haven't really well captured all the aspects of value, and we need to spend some time digging into this. Now that was 2018, so already 2 years have gone by. And I would say that there are shades of movement along this value flower, which is what it's called, but I would say it's not built up enough steam yet. And this is just to show you that this is where we spend our time. We're thinking about how do we quantify patient perspectives? How do we talk to employers about things that are relative to productivity and use that to quantify it? And go ahead to the next slide. And then how do we talk about the value of hope? Now, I don't want you to look at this slide and say, you know, this is just a graphic to show you an example. Value of hope, which has been kind of dismissed by some who don't believe that it's anything but an effort to justify extra expense. But what it really is trying to capture is something that is inherently important to patients and families, just like you heard Jen mentioning. It's the value to that community, that individual, that the people with that condition, of having a potential therapy that will cure their disease, or could maybe help them regain some independence, but could be a curative therapy somewhere down the line for the next generation or for a sibling, for example. And we need to figure out how to incorporate that analysis inside value assessment, not as an alternative, but as an additional viewpoint. Why? Because all the things you've heard on this call, because rare diseases are so important, because there are exciting new innovations, because when we have those innovations come forward, we have to really understand all the aspects that define their value. Go ahead to the next slide. And then lastly, you know, MCDA, multi-criteria decision analysis. So we're digging in on a lot of this. We're doing some projects now where we're trying to define patient preferences, again, in the rheumatoid arthritis space and also in mental health, and trying to then feed that back into a multi-criteria decision analysis framework that can sit side by side so that our models can be able to see a traditional cost effectiveness analysis, but also can see a multi-criteria decision analysis view of the same comparative value of different therapies in a given condition. Why is that important? Because we need to be able to see those pictures side by side, understand their differences, understand why we're getting different pictures of value and cost effectiveness, and also figure out what are the things that are really influencing that. And that, I think, is important to the feedback loop, to research, to driving what kind of clinical research is fundamentally going to change people's lives, not just easy endpoints that are good for getting your therapy across the finish line at FDA. And then last slide. Go ahead to the next slide. And oh, can you hit it twice just so you can see the full picture? So I like to use this visual because MCDA sounds really complicated, and it is. There's a lot of process involved. But the way I try to think about this is right now, value assessment today, there's lots of patient data out there, which Annie, I think, pointed out, but there's not a lot of consistency to the data. It doesn't live in the same place. It's not standardized, and consequently, often it's dismissed because it's like what you see. It's kind of everybody in the pool, but there's no rhyme or reason. It's a little rough water, and there's no clear lanes of understanding. And so we think that investing time in MCDA is important because it offers the opportunity to provide some structure, define what's important to patient communities, and then be able to quantify how much, you know, what are the comparative value of different attributes of the treatment for patients. And so we think that the goal here is to provide order. And I'll go to my last slide, and then I know we want to have time for questions. So I think the overall message for this webinar is it's time to lean in. You know, with regard to cell and gene therapies, we haven't figured out all the aspects, but you've seen through this series of presentations that there's a lot of work and creative thinking and important research being done to kind of move the needle. And I think we have to think about how the methods are going to be ready for the future of additional cell and gene therapies, for additional data inputs for all of the innovation that's happening on the horizon. We need to have the methods ready to be able to analyze it and do so in a way that's patient-centric, truly. So thanks very much for the opportunity, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jennifer, and thanks to all of our participants. We do have about 10 minutes that I would love to answer some audience questions. So if you can just go ahead and type any question you might have in the Q&A box, we will go ahead and answer them from there. I'll give everyone a couple seconds to do that and just highlight the fact that there is, I guess you can't click the link here, but we will send to all registered participants a link directly to the paper that we've been discussing so that you can access that directly. And if you have any questions, my email address is here, and I'm happy to connect you to any of the other panelists if there's something that you, don't have time to get to or would like to discuss more offline. All right, here's one question. So, in this, here we go. How do you think we can bridge the gap of communication between the patient advocates and the medical community? Annie, can you start with that? I think I'd love for your perspective there.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I would have to say, I don't know that there's as much of a gap between patient advocates and the medical community, and that, I guess that depends on what stage of development you're in. I think within therapeutic development, there is a really strong engagement with patient advocates already informing clinical trial inclusion criteria and the clinical trial development. And then you have the clinical trial sites, and there's really tremendous engagement of patient advocates in that process. And then we've seen a really wonderful paradigm shift within regulatory processes so that there's patient engagement there. I think where we're starting to see this shift again in the landscape is how patient advocacy is engaging within the access ecosystem, so that once there's an approval, you're going to a broader subset of the medical community. So not just the medical experts who necessarily were involved in clinical trials, but there's a broader level of education now needed. And so I think working with professional societies is incredibly important so that the professional societies understand the newly developing therapies and which patients are going to be eligible for those therapies, because many of these are tailored for subsets of the population or not necessarily for everyone. There are great advances being made in care standards that we need to ensure that providers are aware of even before the therapies are layered on. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for patient communities to be helping drive these relationships and this engagement, not just with medical providers, but also with payers in advance of the therapeutic approval. So I think I would take that to the next step. I think that's a really great question, but I think the patient advocates have a really key role in helping ensure that payers understand the patient community, the data that's available to inform the decision-making. Many patient communities have registries and natural history data and care standards that we could already be working with payers to understand what's available long before a therapy gets to them for their consideration. And that is really a unique niche that the patient community can be serving in. And something that we at Everylife are really happy to help as patient communities are beginning to navigate and know even how to begin to plug into that and where to begin.
Great, thanks, Annie. And I think Annie just answered the follow-up question that we got in the box of how do advocates access the professional communities. Annie is a great resource for rare disease advocates, and Jen McNary also clearly has a lot of experience in that realm. So if people need to be pointed in the right direction, we, again, reach out to me via my email address, and we're happy to get you connected in the right direction. Another question here, Julia, I think it would be great if you would take this one. Can you elaborate a little bit on the specific shortcomings of the QALY in relation to cell and gene therapies? So I think this is in reference to when you mentioned the societal preferences and some of those pieces. Would you be able to give a little bit more color to that?
I'm so sorry. Could you repeat that? I was just having trouble getting my video back on.
Yeah, no problem. So the question is if you could elaborate specifically on some of the shortcomings of the quality in relation to cell and gene therapies. And I think this is in specific reference to your societal preferences. And if you can just kind of build out on those points for us a bit.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there are so many shortcomings with respect to what the quality can capture. I think one of the, and some of them have been discussed here. I mean, when you looked at that really great flower, the value flower, I think is what it's called, you see a lot of the elements that the quality can't capture. So one of the things that I had mentioned is that the quality really focuses on a specific intervention. It looks at one intervention versus a standard of care. So it doesn't look at, say, societal preferences about where to allocate resources, right? Healthcare resources are scarce and limited, you know, speaking as an economist, in any society, but the quality takes an intervention specific view. So for example, in England, where the quality and cost effectiveness analysis is, you know, really sort of reigns supreme as one of the main ways that that country determines coverage and access, what you see, having studied it, is that society tends to favor the broad diseases, the hypertensions, the diabetes drugs, and they have a really hard time with coverage for rare diseases for few patients. Because again, the quality just can't factor in. Society has decided that we are going to allocate scarce resources to rare disease and to patients with rare diseases. So that's a big one. And I don't know if we wanted to go beyond that, but the quality also has a really hard time. I mean, in addition to its being, you know, proven as discriminatory, and, you know, against disabled, against, you know, seniors, for example, and a whole bunch of range of patients, it also really can't capture hope. It can't capture the value of downstream innovation. It can't capture this notion of insurance against diseases in the future. So we could go on and on. There's just so many limitations about the quality. It's kind of surprising it's lasted this long, frankly. I think there's a real opportunity. I'm speaking off the cuff here with cell and gene therapies and the debate that this has engendered for us to really advance MCDA and other methods. It's time. It's time. It's time for something new and something different.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. And I appreciate you made a good connection referencing NICE in the UK back to Annie's earlier slide about where we're seeing implications of this in reference to the President's Most Favored Nations EO and IPI proposals. So that's a good tie-in back to real world implications too. We only have a couple minutes left. So Jen, I want to let you respond to that question too, because Julia brought up your value flower and kind of how MCDA can assist in this issue we're seeing.
Sure. Well, you know, thanks for that setup. I think the challenge is one of investment, and this is not a commercial, but just a very candid challenge that we're facing in the whole ecology of this is that there is a heavy level of investment in perpetuating the use of quality-only analysis. And that status quo is understandable, but as you've heard during this entire strong female panel, we have to change the paradigm. There are clearly acknowledged gaps in the way we're talking about value, but there's a lot of inertia to exploring new horizons and testing new ways of thinking. And I think that has to shift. And I see positive trends, but we haven't gotten to the tipping point. And I think a big challenge is finding an investment and, you know, figuring out like what is the disease state or the community where we can really lean in and get a better understanding of multiple aspects of value and kind of provide that big picture tipping point conversation that kind of gets the people that are in their rocking chairs on this to kind of sit up and say, oh yeah, you're right, we need to do this better. I don't know what the answer is, but anybody who's on this call who wants to talk with me offline about where we can really lean in and kind of push push the boulder over the side of the cliff, whatever analogy you want to use, I'm all ears, because we're working in the mental health space right now. We chose that topic a year ago, and now look where we are with between COVID and this burgeoning problem with major depression and anxiety. We have a nation that is suddenly having an aha moment that this is a big problem, and it doesn't have just a health impact, it has an economic impact on our country. We think there's an opportunity there to grab the people's attention and say, there are a number of pharmaceutical and non-pharmaceutical treatments for mental health. We don't have the roadmap on what works best in what order for which people. That's what value assessment should be about, not about quibbling over what the launch price of something should be. That's my philosophy, but that's what IVI is committed to. So
can I just add to that for a second there? Because this issue, that was such a great segue, Jen, into something we have not brought up, is the timing of when an assessment is conducted. And one of the issues we're seeing in rare disease, and I know we're over, so I'll make it quick and succinct, but one of the concerns with how assessments are often conducted is, and Jen McNary alluded to this, is often assessments are conducted prior to approval, or they're lined up with the PDUFA date oftentimes, so that the assessment will be released around the same time as the PDUFA date. And one of the reasons that's really challenging in rare disease is because many of us know that the way that clinical trials have been designed in rare disease is to try and streamline trials as much as possible out of recognition for the urgency and unmet need in the rare disease community, and often because of the limited population in rare disease. So we have very small homogeneous trials in rare disease with limited numbers of individuals who participated in that trial and small, narrow inclusion criteria. So once the product is approved, you have limited trial data, meaning not a lot of data about who was exposed to the product, but FDA in their regulatory review reviews safety data and reviews additional arms of the study to arrive at their labeling. So they look to see who else is going to be benefit from the therapy, who else is going to be eligible, who else has been exposed to the product in the trial because of the safety arms of the study. And so the label often is an indication that is broader than the pivotal trial or the study population and the inclusion criteria. What happens though, if the assessment, the value assessment is conducted just based on who was in that clinical trial prior to having an opportunity for there to be broader access and the commercial access in the broader population, is we don't have enough data then to better understand beyond that inclusion criteria, that trial population, how the population benefited from the product, how those values that we're developing really played out in real time. And so one of the other things that needs to be stirred in here is what is the best time to conduct these value assessments so that we actually get the real answers? Because at the end of the day, patient communities want products that work, and we want data to inform that decision-making around the best investments for the products that we're taking. But we want that assessment to happen at a time when we're going to get the best information about that. And we have to give commercial access a moment, and we need to not block it before it happens so that we can get to those answers. So that's just something else to consider, that a lot of these other cell and gene therapies that are coming through are going to have limited data sets in the clinical trial population. And if the value assessment happens too soon, we may not have enough data to inform that value assessment.
Great, thank you so much, Annie. And I know we're a little bit over time. This has been such a fabulous conversation, and I actually have some questions I haven't gotten to. And Jen McNary, I'm so sorry we didn't get to you in this discussion point either. And some of these questions I think I may just take to you after the fact and connect you with folks, because I think they're right up your alley. So thank you all. Thank you to the panelists. I really appreciate it. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out to all of us with follow-up questions. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
thank you.